is Chapter 8, Restoring Democracy. This is all about how can we change our political systems to respond to the challenges we have.
Yeah.
So the first big idea is he's trying to establish that minority rule has arisen in the country. And he uses three main examples as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
One is the Electoral College.
Obviously.
Which hopefully I don't have to explain, but when presidents are elected, it's based on a number of electors from each state. So presidents have to win states instead of win a popular vote.
Yeah.
The Senate, which is not represented by the amount of population. It gives an equal number of senators to each state.
Yeah.
And gerrymandering is the other thing that he talked about, where the lawmakers get to draw districts on the map to determine where representatives come from and what constituencies they represent.
Yeah.
I
mean, look, I think the Constitution, he says, was designed to protect the minority against the majority.
Mm-hmm.
That was the design of the Constitution, right? That was the kind of the goal,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest, in a lot of ways. Now he's arguing it's run amok. This isn't what the founders intended. This is a problem. They didn't see this coming. They didn't see the situation where, you have a state like Wyoming versus a state like California with these massive population differences unbalancing the Senate like this. That wasn't really in their question.
Mm-hmm.
Democracy wasn't so much in their mindset, though. I'm not going to say that the founding fathers were like small d Democrats, because that's not really true.
Mm-hmm.
But even his point about gerrymandering, I take kind of issue with, because Democrats and Republicans gerrymander equally in a lot of ways. Well, that's not really true. Republicans definitely gerrymander more, but you look at a state like Illinois. Illinois currently did redistricting, and that's a very Democrat state, but it still votes 40% Republican. But I think it's 14 of the seats are Democrat and 3 of the seats are Republican, and it can never change because of the way the districts are drawn. So listen, Republicans, Democrats both do it. Republicans do it more. Democrats are more willing to do reforms through independent districting commissions. But yeah,
what are those?
So an independent districting commission is the lawmakers don't draw the maps. You give it to a third party made up of 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and then they draw the maps together. And then normally it comes down to a more representative flow of how the state as a whole votes.
Okay.
So there are states that do that. Michigan is a state that does that. There's a couple other ones. So, those are popping up.
That makes sense.
It's hard, though, because the Democrats don't want to totally unilaterally disarm and then have the Republicans just do it.
Sure.
So it's a hard mix.
Yeah, well, I found this article from Brookings that showed that gerrymandering was a really big deal from 2010 to 2016.
Yeah, it was massive. It got better.
Yeah, and then in 2018 to 2022, it's basically been non-existent.
No, it's got a lot better.
Yeah. So that's not an issue. I would say the Electoral College is an issue.
Yeah, I say the Electoral College and the Senate are the biggest issues. The Senate is a disaster.
Yeah.
The Senate was designed to be undemocratic in the first place. The Senate was people didn't vote for their senators prior to the 19th Amendment. Before the 19th Amendment, senators were appointed by state legislatures.
Mm-hmm.
They were not voted for. So us saying the Senate doesn't have democratic proportionality, the founders would be like, why would they have democratic proportionality? What are you talking about? You know what I mean? Why would they? What do you mean they don't respond to the people's will? That's the point. We're not supposed to. The legislatures appoint them. So, I take some. There's a little bit of Constitution loving out of Stiglitz that I don't think is. I mean, maybe it's not.
Well, he's criticizing the Senate though.
He's criticizing it, but he's saying that this isn't what the founders intended. This is not what the Constitution is supposed to be.
I see.
And I'm saying, no, this is exactly what it's supposed to be, and that's why we need to change it.
Okay.
You know what I mean? It's a little bit.
Well, I guess he's on a different level.
Our policies are the same, but just a little bit of difference where we're coming from, I think.
Yeah.
And look, it's important to bless you. It's important to keep in mind, like, a lot of policies are very popular. Gun control, larger financial regulation, a higher minimum wage. Mm-hmm. And the reason these things aren't getting implemented is because we have this minority control of the government.
Yeah.
Because if we had more popular control, these things would happen right away. Gun control is super popular, depending on what you say. But even banning assault weapons is at like 60% support now. So, and instead of finding new ways to appeal to people, the right flank of the country is now, or this minority, this rich minority, is deciding to change the system itself to work best in their favor.
Yes, yes. And that is kind of what the big idea of his critique here is, I think.
Yeah.
So the next thing he goes into after this misrepresentation of the majority versus minority is how Republicans are making it harder to vote.
Yes.
So part of that is disenfranchisement of voters with excessive ID requirements. He uses the example of holding votes in the middle of the week when all other countries hold votes on Sunday when people aren't working. And I looked into this. I wanted to check, as I was reading through Stiglitz, I wanted to check how accurate a lot of these claims were.
Yeah.
Republicans disenfranchising voters seems very, very real.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Listen, Republicans are trying to limit the amount of people because they're scared when people vote that they'll lose. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
That's what's happening.
Totally. And they also do this by like extending the amount of time that you have to register before an election comes up. There's just all these things that are building up the friction to people voting, because they also know that their constituencies, which are generally older, retired people, have a lot of time to sit around and just make sure like they're paying attention to politics and Fox News all the time. So it's so easy for them to register far before the election, to walk down to the voting booth on a Tuesday afternoon. They're not worried about, they don't need to mail in their votes. They already have all the accessibility.
Right. So, and also it's like no voting on Sundays in many states. Indiana, polls close at 6 p.m. We're talking about Gary, Indiana in the beginning of this podcast. Indiana, polls are closing at 6 p.m. When do you get off work? 5?
Yeah.
You got to make back to your polling place in an hour? That's some people's whole commute.
Totally.
So that's a huge problem. And this all became possible because of a Supreme Court decision in 2013. In our next book club, we'll get more into this in depth. But in 2013, the Supreme Court took away specific aspects of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that allowed states to make their own voting laws without being checked by the federal government. Because in a response to the Civil Rights Act and the Civil Rights Movement, the federal government had to approve states in the South making voting changes so that it was within a framework of good government, good democracy.
Okay.
In 2013, that went away. And also, there are districts in the United States that are black majority districts, brown majority districts, specifically because the Voting Rights Act says that you need minority representation and you can't gerrymander African American representation out of Congress. You can't gerrymander it out. Since 2013, that's no longer the case. And you can basically gerrymander them out. And in a lot of areas, we saw in in Mississippi, Alabama, in this past redistricting cycle in 2020, by proportionality, African Americans should have 2 congressional seats in Alabama. But there's only 1. And there was a Supreme Court case that tried to get it to 2, but the Supreme Court decided not to take it up. It didn't work out. There's only 1 seat now. But there's all these taking away of minority voting rights that are because of a 2013 court decision. Yeah, it's crazy.
Interesting. That is crazy. So he does propose a few reforms, although albeit very, very briefly. He says 6 reforms can make a difference here. Voting day a holiday or voting on Sunday, already talked about.
Absolutely.
Paying people to vote. I'm down for that.
I think that's fine.
Yeah. I'm trying to think. It's what? It would definitely cost the government, $1 billion most? Probably less than $1 billion.
I mean, if it's $10 per person?
Yeah.
It's $3 billion, right?
Yeah.
So
that could work. I mean, 300 million people aren't voting. So
true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have making it easier to register, which is extremely vague, I will note. Ending disenfranchisement for people who have served prison time.
Yeah, that's a huge one.
Yes.
Because I think it's 7% of African Americans can't vote because they were convicted of something in the past.
Yeah.
7% of African American population can't vote. That's insane.
Yeah, that is ridiculous.
That's insane.
I mean,
2.2 million people.
You and I probably both agree that prisoners should be able to vote. People in prison.
I think so. I think voting is one of those inalienable rights that you would have to do something like, unless it's a violent crime. I do think I think if it's a violent crime, I don't think you should have the right to vote, actually.
Maybe, but even that, I mean, I don't think taking away someone's right to vote is like, I don't think people are going to prison. They're like, oh no, now I can't vote. Like, they're not really worried about losing that. I think that someone committing a crime does not necessarily change their view on how the country should be run.
That's a conversation for another time.
Sure.
Yeah, that's going to get too in the weeds. But I definitely go back and forth on the should people in prison be able to vote? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay. Ending gerrymandering and ensuring a path to citizenship for the dreamers.
Yeah.
Which are people who have grown up in the country, know no other home for the U.S. They're immigrants who came here when they were kids, but because they weren't born here, they aren't citizens.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with mostly all of those. I think that's good. I don't know. Yeah, how do you feel about mandatory voting?
I like it.
I think it's good too.
Yeah.
But I think I like the paying people to vote more than the mandatory voting, because one of our things that we talk about a lot is carrot versus stick.
Yes.
And paying people is carrot, saying that you have to vote is stick, because now you're going to penalize them for not voting. It gets a little harder. You know what I mean? I
guess. I think I've read studies that enforced mandatory voting is extremely effective.
No, I believe it. Yeah.
And
Australia does it, and they have great voter turnout.
Exactly.
Like almost everybody.
So they can just fine people, and then it would cost less for the government.
That's true.
So I think it could make sense. The only problem is kind of goes back to the conversation we had last week about the efficacy of democracy. And if you're forcing a bunch of people to vote, then you're almost certainly going to get more uninformed voters.
Yeah.
But who knows? That could just end up not really making a difference even.
Yeah, who knows? So then he goes into the checks and balances system.
Yep.
And he's emphasizing that Trump and Republicans have threatened repeatedly to make it easier to fire federal employees. Now, this is a problem because we made it kind of difficult to fire federal employees because we don't want the executive branch and the functions of the executive branch to become politicized. We want the executive to be functionary. We want it to do what the legislator says, you know? So by cycling in and out these federal employees every time that there's a new president, you're having no institutional knowledge in the system because there was benefit to that.
Yeah.
And you're politicizing these processes much more than they should be or were designed to be. You know, these are supposed to be experts, not people that are just like totally up to the people's will.
True. I didn't even think about it as that.
What do you think?
I was thinking about it as consolidating power.
Oh, yeah, that.
Like just installing more people who are more loyal to the president.
Yeah.
That's scary.
It's super scary. I mean, think about it. If we had more people who were loyal to the president in 2020, who knows what would have happened?
Exactly.
It was because we didn't have enough people loyal to him.
But on the other hand, I do wonder, like, you want to have people who are good at their jobs.
Oh, yeah.
And I feel like the more you get into the weeds learning about politics, the more you learn that the proper execution of policies is usually probably more important than whatever legislation is actually passed.
True. Absolutely.
So I do sometimes wonder if execution... if this almost can contribute to the argument that the government is an inefficient bureaucracy, and if there is able to be more competition as far as government employment, could that be beneficial?
Maybe. I mean, it depends on who's doing the hiring. I think if you want to change the way federal employees get hired and fired, and make it like if it's a merit system that becomes a more merit system, that's great. Sure. If you're going to replace this not so great merit system with a political system, it's not good. If you want to replace this not so great merit system with a better merit system, that's cool. But if we want to replace this not so great merit system with a totally politicized system, I don't think there is actually competition.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. It's almost like turning it into the Supreme Court.
Exactly.
As we transition. To the next thing Stiglitz goes into.
Look at that. That's something you get from a lot of podcasting experience, Ben. Look at you.
Oh, yeah. Huge. So we're talking about abuses to checks and balances, the need to maintain them. Big part of that is him talking about the judiciary, talking about how it's become a partisan mechanism, and it's obviously not supposed to be. We've talked about this before. It's supposed to be an unpartisan interpreter of the language of the law.
Yeah.
But it's made several brazen decisions in recent years that is kind of showing that it's losing this impartial aura to it.
It's no longer like the national consciousness no longer believes that the Supreme Court is impartial, which is a break. Whether it was true or not, the people generally used to believe that the Supreme Court was this holy institution that was above all of this political strife going on in the House and the Senate and everything, and that's gone now.
Yeah. He uses Citizens United as an example, saying companies are people and can be treated as such.
Yeah.
It's clearly ridiculous. So I don't know. I feel like I should explain. I feel like that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because and Stiglitz explains corporations are entities created by the government.
Exactly.
And thus they can be given rights by the government. And also we just know that companies aren't people. Like, they don't need to be given the rights that a person does because a company doesn't suffer or have emotion. That they're not human.
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't need
to. Listen, I'm not going to argue with any of that. Yeah. I'm just going to emphasize exactly what you just said. Look, Citizens United definitely broke a lot of our already fragile electoral financial system. Okay. The way that we finance elections was already broken. Citizens United made it even harder. And now that PACs can spend unlimited money and not have to report where the money came from is a big deal. We should be able to know who's funding this DeSantis PAC that has $200 million.
Yes.
We should be able to know who's funding the Trump War Room and who's funding the Biden campaign. We should know these things.
Totally.
We should be allowed to know these things.
Yeah.
Now, what I just said was kind of incorrect. When I say funding the Biden campaign, I don't mean Biden's actual campaign. We know that. But the political action committees that run ads on behalf of Biden without communicating to Biden, we should know who their donors are.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. It's a nuance that.
But then how do we attack? I don't want to say attack the judges, but how do we change our judicial system to either make it less partisan?
Yeah.
What do we do?
And so I kind of had a problem with Stiglitz here because I thought the reforms he proposes are 1, term limits on judges, and 2, it's packing the court. So it's adding Supreme Court justices. Specifically suggests we should add 2 more justices.
Well, he doesn't say that.
Doesn't he?
Well, he starts off by saying the Democrats should not pack the court. And then he says we should amend the Constitution to add term limits. And then until that amendment goes into full effect, we should pack the court.
Yes.
But overall, he doesn't say we should just pack the court.
Okay, you're right.
Yeah. He doesn't say like Democrats should just put 100 people on the Supreme Court.
Yes.
Or like put 10 people on the Supreme Court and hold it there. He wants to tie that to more amendments.
Sure.
And I just don't think that solves the problem at all.
No, I agree. He also only proposes term limits of 20 years.
Right.
Which I think is not responsive enough to the judges.
Not at all.
At all. And I think packing the court, he mentions why packing the court would be a bad idea. I agree.
Yeah, I think it's a bad idea.
It's a slippery slope. So I don't know. Like, I don't like what he proposes here. I think shorter term limits is something I would definitely agree to. I mean, we've talked about democratizing judges so they're not appointed by presidents. I think that could work, but I worry because what we see right now is that democracy drives polarization. It's still like judges could end up pandering to certain bases just as much as political candidates currently do.
But I know a lot of states currently have elections for their Supreme Courts. Wisconsin, North Carolina, these places have elections for their Supreme Courts. And, it's partisan, but it is already partisan. That's like kind of my philosophy of it. It's like, it's already partisan. Putting term limits doesn't change it. Packing the courts doesn't change it. The only thing we can do is lean into it. The only thing we can do is say, yep, the courts are partisan. Who do you want to be on the courts? Do you want liberals or conservative on the courts? It's all partisan anyway, guys. Who do you want? And I think that's the only way forward. So I would like Supreme Court elections every 10 years. That's what I'd want.
Okay.
That's what I'd want. And look, I don't know the best way to do that. Maybe you say, here's a list of 30 people, pick 10. All non-incumbent. You can all non-partisan. You don't have to put a D or R next to their name. Okay. You don't have to put a liberal nomer or a conservative nomer.
Okay.
Let their name just be their names. And
that's tough too, though, because that's what I was thinking. Like, can we? It seems impossible to expect voters. This is where my problem.
It's impossible to expect voters to know 30 people's names.
Well, not even just names, but like they're not going to be familiar. I don't think they're going to be familiar with one judge's like record.
Oh yeah.
On decisions they've made, and also like how good that decision has been at interpreting the law.
Yeah.
Maybe
we should change who appoints judges?
Yeah, it's almost
maybe the House of Representatives should appoint judges.
Okay, or could we create some kind of third part, like some other body? Or is it just like no matter what we do, partisanship will bleed in?
I think my theory is that no matter what we do, partisanship will bleed in. And to think anything otherwise is to just totally disarm to the people who will be capable of utilizing that partisan power to the fullest extent. Because that's what I think happened. I think the Republican Party accepted a long time ago that the courts were partisan, and they poured millions upon millions of dollars into the Federalist Society, which we've talked about on this show in the past. But Federalist Society is a group of conservative legal scholars and legal theorists and legal organizations that groom people into becoming Supreme Court justices and court justices on the federal level. And they've been doing that for years. Democrats don't have a Federalist Society alternative.
Sure.
You know what I mean? The liberals don't have that. So that's my issue with the Supreme Court. And I don't know what the right answer is. Maybe it's elections. Maybe it's a third party appointing. Maybe the House of Representatives should appoint. I don't know what it is.
That is so hard.
Maybe it's 5-year terms. Maybe it's 5-year terms instead of 20. And the Democrats keeps appointing. The president keeps appointing.
Yeah, I think 5-year terms could be okay.
The life thing is ridiculous.
True. Clarence Thomas having been on the court for about 30 years
is insane.
Is crazy.
It's insane. All right. So now let's get into the power of money.
Yes.
Let's get into the power of money. So money has totally corrupted our political system, and everybody who is into politics knows this. It's not a secret. There's like a kind of cynicism about it. Like everyone just kind of accepts like, oh yeah, it's all corrupt anyway.
Yes.
There's this overwhelming cynicism that has totally captured the American population. Like, oh yeah, everyone's bought off. Everyone's sold off to another country. Everyone's owned by a billionaire. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And I think he specifically talks about how like in the case of Trump, it's like, okay, it's a government by a rent seeker.
Right.
So it's going to be a government for rent seekers.
That's an awesome point.
Yeah. And I think like that's not something that's exclusive to Trump.
No.
Generally, the rent seekers are the very rich. And so they wield extreme influence with candidates because they're donors. And it's not even just because they're donors. It's because these are the people who are making the biggest differences in the constituencies. Yeah. Even. Yeah. He gives a few examples about oil companies negotiating with the government to get land use rights on the cheap. Drug companies negotiating so that when the Medicare bill is passed, that the government can't negotiate on price.
Yeah,
that
which is insane.
Absolutely crazy.
So I break that down into 2 categories. There's moments when the government gives rich people things for nothing, and when the government buys things from rich people for a lot.
Yeah,
those are the 2 types of like political corruption that I'm thinking about. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is so about the Medicare thing, because the Medicare drug pricing is something that we've talked about in America since like 2004. I'm a really big nerd, and I recently watched the John Kerry versus George Bush debates from 2004.
Nice.
And back then, John Kerry was talking about Medicare negotiating drug prices.
Really?
Yes. That was one of the things he was running on. Luckily, now, with the pass of the Inflation Reduction Act under Biden, the presidency and Medicare can now negotiate drug prices. That is now a thing that we can do, which will reduce Medicare costs by a lot, like at least $100 billion or something crazy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, 50 to 100 billion, somewhere around there.
Okay.
Big range, but I don't remember it. But point is, that's huge.
Yes.
And I think that's a theme for all these Stiglitz propositions that we're going to get through.
Yes.
A lot of it is what Biden's done. And we'll talk about that as we go through. A lot of it is what his agenda is and what he's done already, which is kind of crazy to think about.
I'm not enough of a nerd to have the connection between the current Biden policies, so you'll fill me in on that.
Yeah.
So next he goes into the Supreme Court increasing the power of money in politics, which we kind of just talked about. He focuses on Citizens United and how the Supreme Court has decided that PACs don't have to disclose anything about their donors or their actions. Like they don't have to submit a balance sheet or where their money is gone.
Right.
And that gives too much power to donors.
Yep.
It gives donors
unlimited power.
Unlimited donating power.
Totally unlimited donating power.
Yeah. I can move on from that.
No, I mean, I don't really know if I have anything else that I really... Okay, so the big one now is the revolving door.
Oh, I have more for this chapter.
Oh, do you? Okay.
I get to the revolving door in a little bit.
Okay, so when we're talking about curbing campaign spending...
Yes.
PACs should only be able to make contributions to candidate if... So, like, how can we deal with PACs donating all this money? What can we do? Mm-hmm. And there are two big solutions, and I kind of love both of them. Mm-hmm. Fund campaigns through public dollars and force all the cable stations to give equal airtime to each individual candidate.
Yes.
I think those are awesome solutions.
I like the first, public leveling of spending.
I love that one.
Mandatory airtime. I'm okay with that. I wonder if it should be expanded. I feel like it should be expanded to other modes of communication, other media.
Totally.
I think this should be a place where the government should have a little bit more power with social media companies. Mm-hmm. I feel like there should maybe be like unified campaign accounts.
Oh yeah.
That are maybe they have to pay the social media platforms, but they're promoted. They're heavily promoted. TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, everything that equally give time of like content time and attention to all the candidates so that their messages can be broadcast to everyone on all platforms.
Yeah. So it's not about like candidates aren't spending their money trying to get eyes on these social media platforms. Mm-hmm. They're being given to them equally, and I think that's a great idea.
Yeah,
because that's the same theory as to giving equal airtime, but expanding it to the new media aspects that we now thrive on more than cable.
Yeah,
right.
That's where I'm at. The only other thing is I wonder if would it be smart to normalize, say, the questions that these candidates are asked in, let's say, on air if they're going on to interviews, or that they're given questions, they're prompted to answer certain questions. And so for TikTok or something, or YouTube, they make a video as an answer to each question, giving an overview of their policies. Something to equalize the playing field and to make it so that people are voting based on the actual policy decisions rather than who they're most familiar with because of ads.
Yep. It's a great point.
Yeah.
So another thing that we could do to limit campaign spending is, I want to talk about the campaign funds through public dollars for a second here. That was pushed for by the Democrats back in 2021. It was the For the People's Act. And that was a whole overhaul of the election system and would give federal dollars to campaigns and would like match dollars for every individual who donated to you. The government would match a certain percent of that money. Mm-hmm. So it would it would, small dollar donations would have a bigger impact.
Yes, they'd be amplified.
Yes. So then the other thing he's talking about is PAC contributions. Currently, PAC contributions only have to be done through the CEO. Only the CEO of a PAC can push through a campaign contribution. or make these contributions. Now, if a supermajority of boards, if a supermajority was needed to get the donations to the PAC, Citizens United would be able to do a lot less damage. PACs would be able to raise a lot less money.
Yeah.
I think that's a definitely great way to go.
And the political donations would be much more likely to reflect the best interests of a company rather than necessarily the personal interests of a CEO.
Absolutely.
Which is better. Still probably not great.
Still not great, but I definitely think that's better.
Yeah. Now, next up, I have revolving doors.
Me too.
Which I think makes a lot of sense as far as so what Stiglitz means by a revolving door is there is this system where politicians or other executive branch workers will go into Washington and they will do their job, but of course their jobs are limited, their terms are limited, maybe they don't get reelected. But during their terms, they'll be making deals with business people to line up jobs for themselves once they get out of office. And in return for having those jobs lined up, they'll include or they'll act pro-business while they're in office.
Yeah.
Stiglitz talks about this as a huge problem, that it's one that enables market power basically to work its way into our politics too much. My problem here is I don't think he really gave a way to change it.
He gave nothing.
No, he said the norms need to change. We need to upgrade the feel. Like, we have to get rid of the stench on our politics so that it's more ivory tower-esque almost.
I know, and I just don't listen. There are things that could. He says cooling off periods need to be extended. That's like his big solution. Cooling off periods.
Okay.
And that's like, you can't get a job in this industry for 5 years after you have this job.
Huh.
Obama had some things like that. Trump relaxed it a bit, but still had it. Trump didn't totally get rid of it. But this isn't enough because they're just going to wait and then they get a big signing bonus. You know what I mean? So it's like, I read one study that found former Senate staffers who have become revolving door lobbyists suffer an average 24% drop in generated revenue when their previous employer leaves the Senate. So people are losing drastic amounts of money when the senator that they worked for leaves the Senate because they lose all their power. The person so that's been found to happen. So it's like really in bed with people's salaries. It's like a reason that they're getting employed. They're losing a quarter of their salaries after their boss leaves the Senate.
That's crazy.
Their ex-boss leaves the Senate. So I don't know what the answer to the revolving door is. I don't know. You can't have total federal pensions for everybody who was ever in the Treasury Department. So you can't go work on Wall Street and we're going to pay you out forever. We can't do that. So I don't know what the answer is, but the revolving door is the biggest problem.
You think so?
I think it's one of the biggest problems because how can we trust these people to take the opinions of the collective, which is their job as government, when they still have such an awful amount of self-interest right at their fingertips?
Mm-hmm. It's so funny because this is something that I mentioned on our debate last week is like the idea of paying government officials way more.
Yeah.
Right now, I mean, the most well-paid executive is the president at $400,000 a year, which is a good salary.
Yeah.
But
it's
also
like good.
It's not even, I don't think it's even a top 1%.
You're top 1%. 350 is top 1%, I think.
Okay.
So you're just about top 1%.
Okay. Yeah, but I think them and legislators should be much better paid because I do feel like, I mean, I don't know. This is something where I don't have evidence on, so this is speculation, but I feel like that could reduce corruption. That does, so I just want to put that out there.
No, that's been an idea for a while, that higher salaries and better pay will reduce corruption because there's less need for the corruption. But I don't know what the answer is to the revolving door system. Honestly, maybe if you work for the Treasury Department, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to work on Wall Street, or maybe you're only allowed to work for nonprofits, or you know what I mean? Like maybe if you're going to dedicate your life to public service, maybe you do get a little bit of a pension of like $30,000 a year, and we say, okay, now you don't get to be a Wall Street hedge funder anymore. That's not allowed. And now you can only work for nonprofits going forward. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just hard to say that because that's very limiting.
No, it's super limiting. And then who's going to want to do these jobs?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Who's going to want to do the jobs? So
yeah,
it's hard.
Especially when they have a necessary finite lifespan.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's just difficult. And the same way I feel trapped to know the answer, I feel like I feel Stiglitz not knowing what to do here.
Yeah.
I feel that from him too.
Exactly. Like he knows it's a problem and it's upsetting that he doesn't really know the solution.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
So the next thing, he has a section called the need for a new movement.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of very meh, kind of gray matter.
It's very nebulous. It's
Yeah.
very broad. It's very much like, okay, we have multiple progressive movements with trans activism, with reproductive health care, with black and brown activism. We need to unite all of these and have a solid voting block. And yeah, it's like, yeah, of course. Sure.
But, and like, I would expect that's already being, like, I would expect there's already a lot of cooperation, or at the very least, like these coalitions are voting for they're supporting the same candidates.
Listen, are there some progressive movements that don't believe in voting? Yes. Do they need to get over themselves? Yes.
Okay.
Is that like, I don't know. It's just hard. It seems to me that this chapter, this section for him is much like, okay, Republicans have this big voting block, but there's all these tensions in there. We have working class white people voting with the big business owner hedge fund guys. And that constant conflict will mean that their coalition will break apart someday. But the progressive voting base has all these different beliefs about challenging power. And because of that, we should never be broken. It's like, yeah, but it sounds like it's like a political speech rather than like an actual prescription.
Yeah.
Because it's like, no, I agree with you. But
Exactly.
where's this? What should we do?
Yeah.
And there isn't a really what should we do. Honestly, this section just kind of reads to me like, go vote.
Exactly.
And like, yeah, we should go vote.
Exactly.
I don't know. That's hard. And then the last thing I have here is talking about wealth in our democracy. And this is very obvious. Yeah. No democracy can function if the wealth divide in the country is too large. No tinkering with any of our rules will matter because wealth will always find a way to corrupt to break the rule.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter how much we try to make the system nonpartisan. It doesn't matter how many years the term limits is. None of that matters because wealth can always buy power.
Mm-hmm.
And so we need to attack wealth and we need to attack power. Good example is Murdoch with Fox News. Obviously, that is a huge example of the wealth buying influence. And, far right movements are very prominent in Europe right now, in America. Australia doesn't have a far right movement, and it's because they don't really have a far right media ecosystem.
Really?
Yeah. They don't have a Murdoch in Australia.
Interesting.
They don't have an equivalent. So, and they don't have a far right movement. And I think that's really interesting because it really is that astroturfed.
Yeah.
It's that, and I say astroturfed, it's like fake grass. It's like someone grew it out of nothing.
Yes.
And that's what's happening with these far right movements, I believe. I think they're all grown out of nothing.
Sure.